Ukraine's summer offensive continues with fierce fighting. Although the Kyiv authorities kept their mouths shut about the details of these operations, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he had launched a counterattack. Ukrainian forces captured the village of Oruzgan in the border area between the Zaporizhia and Donetsk regions. This brings the total number of villages liberated during Ukraine's summer offensive to 8. The gain means that the summer offensive recaptured about 100 kilometers squared of Ukrainian territory from Russian forces. However, the attack continues to take the form of probes by Ukrainian forces rather than large movements of large-scale mechanized infantry units at the brigade level. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Anna Malia stated that in the area close to the administrative border between Zaporizhia and Donetsk regions, Ukrainian forces are advancing between 500 and 1,000 meters in the area around the 205-18 Farm Road and the Molkyry Gala River. Anna Malia stated that she was rescued around 3 squares. It was reported nearby that Ukrainian forces cleared local minefields and are preparing to enter Novopil and Rivnopil. Ukrainian flags flying over settlements in the Donetsk region and Zaporizhia Oblast were touted by Ukraine as a sign of early progress. But the Russians are trying to slow down the actions of the Ukrainian army. Russian troops blew up a dam in the Merkuryli River in Donetsk Oblast, causing flooding on both river banks. The actions of the Russian forces are not enough to slow down the Ukrainian attacks. The Ukrainian armed forces continue to advance by increasing the intensity of attacks in the eastern and southern axes. In the past day, the Ukrainian Defense Forces destroyed the launch pad of Russian drones near the town of Svatov in the Luhansk region. On the Svatov-Kupiansk axis, the place where the Russians launched their UAVs in the operation area of the Ukrainian troops was detected and blown up. Achilles soldiers attacked the UAV company with the 92nd Separate Motorized Brigade and performed well. Operators used Mavic 3 and Mavic 3 Tesla birds donated by the United 24 initiative. Fighters of the 92nd Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces previously blinded Russian satellite communications in the same operation area. Destroying these eyes would mean significantly weakening Russian troops, aviation, and air defense. There are also reports of unsuccessful Russian counterattacks in Makharovka. However, Ukrainian spokespersons claim that the village is still in Ukrainian hands. Clashes continue in the areas east of Makharovka. In the HIMARS attacks, Ukraine captured a Russian-occupied administrative center in Henichsk in the Sea of Azov and reportedly eliminated the commander of the 35th Russian Army. Regular attacks were also reported in the Russian-occupied Tokmak and Melitopol in the Zaporizhia region, part of the strategic and occupied land corridor that Ukraine may attempt to cut in operations that could be considered shaping operations prior to mechanized infantry attacks. In addition to the small gain in Oruzgan and the movement towards Nikopol and Novopil, Ukrainian forces continue defensive operations in the western part of the Zaporizhia region and near Bakhmut. Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces continued some limited ground attacks southwest of Orikhiv and south of Huly-Pol in the western Zaporizhia region. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Anna Malia reported that Ukrainian forces are advancing 250 meters northeast of Bakhmut and 200 meters south of Bakhmut. Russian artillery activity in other parts of Ukraine increased significantly yesterday, presumably to divert Ukrainian resources from areas where Ukrainian forces are attacking. This was especially true for the Kharkiv and Sumy regions, which were heavily bombarded yesterday. About 30 communities in the regions were bombed. In Sumy, local authorities reported 21 separate artillery fires consisting of 101 shells. A dam killed 7 transport workers of a local lumber company. On the other hand, analyzed satellite images showed that since the beginning of the summer offensive, Russia has transferred 27 helicopters to the Berdyansk airport, located in the occupied southern Zaporizhia region on the Sea of Azov. The 27 helicopters described are variants of the K-52. Although there are different versions, the K-52 is considered Russia's most modern attack helicopter from the 1990s. My series are usually helicopter warships and platoon-level troop transports. The K-29 is a general military helicopter that has been heavily used by the Russian Navy since the 1960s and is a mainstay for the evacuation of the wounded. On the other hand, Russian President Vladimir Putin stated that the counterattack started before Kyiv's approval and that Ukraine was conducting large-scale operations. However, according to a Kremlin reading, Kiev did not succeed in any of the sectors. The Russian Defense Ministry said that the Ukrainian armed forces suffered catastrophic losses in manpower and equipment. However, the Ukrainian General Staff said in a statement the other day that Moscow forces were in panic mode and suffered frantic losses in manpower. Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Russian oligarch and Wagner Group mercenary chief, noted that in apparent contradiction to Putin's comments, it is too early to tell whether Kiev has succeeded in its efforts. Yevgeny Prigozhin expressed that the potential of the counterattack is far from exhausted. In a statement posted on social media, Prigozhin added that Russia should wait about 6 to 8 weeks to determine whether Ukraine has succeeded in this concerted move. As you can see, Ukraine's counterattack operations continue unabated. Kiev troops are making small gains. The decisive advance of Ukraine inflicts casualties on the Russian troops. Still, the Russian troops are not willing to leave the battlefield. In addition, the Ukrainian counterattack had been expected for 6 months. This was enough time for the Russian troops to strengthen their defenses from the border of western Russia to occupied Crimea in the Black Sea. Russia has prepared thousands of defensive positions, including minefields, anti-tank trenches, rows of concrete, dragon's tooth barricades, and trenches. Positions studied in April using satellite imagery are concentrated in the strategically important south, where Kiev could aim to cut Russia's land bridge to Crimea and divide the Kremlin's forces. Military analysts said that Ukraine, which has the bulk of its counterattack forces on the flanks, can monitor where Moscow sends its troops to strengthen its lines and attack more thinly defended areas, including the east. Ben Berry, senior fellow on ground warfare at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, stated that Ukraine has options. Analysts say that the Ukrainian army has formed 12 armored brigades for the operation, 9 of which are trained and equipped by the West. A brigade typically consists of at least 3,500 to 4,000 soldiers. Ukraine reported forming 8 assault brigades of 40,000 soldiers recruited by the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Konrad Mazyka, a Poland-based military analyst who closely followed the war, said that only 3 of the 12 brigades have been seen in the fighting in the southeast so far. The main thrusters came near the Kyiv-controlled town of Orikhiv in the Zaporizhia region and Velika Novosilka in the Donetsk region, about 80 kilometers to the east. These attacks may indicate that the Ukrainian general's eye is on Tokmak, an occupied town in the Zaporizhia region, about 25 kilometers from the front line. Another 50 kilometers away is the city of Melitopol. Both settlements were heavily fortified. Also, Moscow's strategy in the south seeks to maximize Ukraine's casualties before Kiev reaches the main Russian defensive line about 10 to 15 kilometers away. We'll see in the coming days whether this strategy of the Moscow troops succeeds. However, when we look at what has happened on the front lines so far, we realize that the counterattack operations are progressing in favor of Ukraine. How do you think the successes of counteroffensive operations might affect the course of the Ukrainian war? The counteroffensive operations of the Ukrainian army continued to affect the Zaporizhia region. The most intense clashes still take place south of Velika Novosilka. The Ukrainian 35th and 137th Mechanized Brigades managed to make a deep and powerful breakthrough along the hills west of the Mokry Yaly River. First of all, the Ukrainians launched massive artillery preparations on the first line of Russian defense along the tree lines in this critical area. Then the Ukrainian forces launched a mechanized attack on Neskikny, south of Velika Novosilka, with a large number of armored combat vehicles. The direction of this attack soon began to shift towards the city of Storazev, located southwest of Neskikny. So the Ukrainians managed to launch an intense mechanized attack on both cities south of Velika Novosilka. On the other hand, Ukrainian troops launched a major offensive operation in Blahodan. These striking attacks caught the attention of the Russians and ensured the course of the Ukrainian infantry unit advancing in the direction of Neskikny and Storazev. Ukrainian infantry units quickly closed the distance in both cities at the same time and started attacking everything that was left of the Russian defensive line. The aim of the Ukrainian infantry units at both Neskikny and Storazev was to repeat this process endlessly, and with each iteration, the Russian defense was collapsing faster and faster. After the first wave of attacks, the Russians had to withdraw from Neskikny, Storazev, and Blahodan. It launched the second wave of attacks by Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia region, and confirmed by the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine that these attacks resulted in the liberation of Makiivka. The Ukrainian attacks at Makiivka were more severe, and the Ukrainians began using tanks to break through the Russian trenches in the wooded rows around the village as the infantry attacked the village. It was reported that the 35th and 137th Mechanized Brigades of Ukraine also participated in these striking offensive operations. It turned out that the Russians were not prepared for such a strong attack, and that the Russian soldiers left their positions in these areas. Immediately after the Ukrainians entered Makiivka, also when the entire Ukrainian assault unit was in the Makiivka area, the Russians immediately tried to level the village using air and regular thermobaric cannons. On the same day, Russian forces launched a counterattack in the direction of Makiivka, which is thought to be most likely to protect the retreating flanks from Hrivna forces. This attack attempt was unsuccessful, but the Russians did not want to give up Makiivka easily. Moscow sources reported that Russian forces launched at least 3 strong attacks on Makiivka during the day, forcing the Ukrainians to use their forces there. Such actions relieved the pressure from Hrivna and allowed Russian troops to repel small Ukrainian attacks, even if some of the personnel had gone to the next line of defense. Meanwhile, Russian sources reported that they were actively digging a trench 700 meters south of Makiivka, but all these Russian efforts could not prevent Makiivka from falling under the domination of Ukrainian forces. After the Ukrainians waved their flags in Makiivka, Kiev's grand offensive plans continued to run like clockwork. Simultaneously with offensive operations in Makiivka, Ukrainian forces were destroying Russian troops and reinforcements in the rear. Ukrainian sources have confirmed that they have deployed the most feared drone detachment here, namely the Media's Birds Attack UAV Battalion. The other day, Media's Birds destroyed 8 Russian tanks. 4 of these attacks were geographically identified, and it turned out that Media's Birds destroyed 2 Russian tanks at Staromansky and 2 at Zvyazny, Virginia. The Ukrainians also relocated Special Operators Omega, who reported on the offensive operation in the Starobilsk in which they destroyed Russian tanks. Finally, reconnaissance aircraft detachments of the Ukrainian Army from the 55th and 129th Brigades explained how, in coordination with the artillery crews, they destroyed at least 4 pieces of equipment on Staromalinivka. After the destruction of the Russian tanks, the Ukrainians continued their offensive and reconnaissance operations in Zaporizhia. As for the further development of the counterattack operation, Russian sources reported that the Ukrainians have finished the demining process between Livny and Prytny and are conducting a reconnaissance operation in force. These reconnaissance operations were a strong indication that the next powerful attack could come from this direction. In addition, reconnaissance and cleaning operations of the Ukrainians continued in Novogrivo, northeast of Livny. Considering these efforts, the Ukrainians, as expected, managed to blockade Livny and Prytny, and Novogorgievka. Livny and Novogrivo were among the cities liberated as a result of the offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces. After liberating these 2 cities, the Ukrainians continued their advance in line with the offensive plans of Kiev. The city of Hrivna Hill was among the targets of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainians had almost succeeded in putting the Russians under a clamp in the Zaporizhia region. As a result of these striking offensive operations, the Ukrainians managed to liberate all 6 settlements and continued their advance on the critical front lines between Zaporizhia and Donetsk. In other words, Ukraine was leading an offensive to gain ground and inflict casualties with skilled infantry units, deliberate attacks, and small-scale offensive tactics. The first 2 weeks of the long-awaited Ukrainian armed forces counter-offensive in Zaporizhia has so far been deliberate and methodical. UAVs and armored vehicles of the Ukrainian army were used in targeted attacks on short-range targets, usually no more than 1 or 2 forest lines or villages. Independent information sources and Russian military bloggers all agreed that Kiev's top military leadership has so far followed the conservative strategy of eroding Russian formations over time, gradually gaining ground, avoiding major risks, and limiting Ukrainian losses as much as possible. In fact, Russian military bloggers and information sources were right about this, because when we look at the 2-week Ukrainian offensive operation on the Zaporizhia-Donetsk front lines, we can clearly see that the Russian troops abandoned their equipment, ammunition, weapons, and escaped at the expense of their lives, ending the clashes. Pro-Russian blogger Vladimir Rogov suggested that the Ukrainian attack was hit first by Russian artillery and then by anti-tank missiles launched by Russian infantry. Rogov also claimed that when the Ukrainians withdrew, their path to safety was seeded by landmines sent by Russian artillery, and the vehicles that lost their tracks in the unexpected minefield were later destroyed by Russian helicopters. However, the offensive operations carried out by the Ukrainians in Zaporizhia continued successfully with the support of the German-made Leopard 2 battle tanks and the US-made Dam-1 Bradley battleships. Vladimir Rogov, on the other hand, changed his views after these successful attacks of the Ukrainians and accepted that the Ukrainian forces were advancing decisively on the Zaporizhia-Donetsk steppes. But can the Ukrainian advance in Zaporizhia reach the depths of the Donetsk region? Considering the tensions between the Wagner mercenaries and the Russian Ministry of Defense at the moment on the Donetsk front line, and the Wagner boss withdrawing his forces from Bakhmut, it would not be a surprise that the Ukrainians would retarget this city in the coming days. In summary, Ukrainians may want to crown their striking achievements in Zaporizhia on the front lines in the Donetsk region. Moscow's plans to occupy Ukrainian lands were interrupted by the West's support of Kiev. For this reason, the Russian administration both wants to escalate the war in order to find a way out and tries to intimidate Western Europe to prevent military and financial support to Kiev against the risky actions of the Russians in the Baltics, the North Atlantic, the Irish Sea, and the North Sea. The NATO alliance is on the alert. The United Kingdom is making critical moves, especially for the safety of this 1,200-kilometer pipeline, which starts near St. Petersburg and passes under the Baltic Sea and reaches Germany. Because the United Kingdom also has submarine cables and important connection tools for telecommunication on this strategic pipeline. Although the UK has an interest in the Nord Stream pipeline, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, shared reports that he claimed the West was responsible for the explosion in the pipeline. Also in his Telegram statement, Medvedev highlighted the alleged evidence that Russia has exposed the West's interference in crucial energy infrastructure to justify potential excessive retaliatory measures against the West. Russian Security Council Vice Chairman Dmitry Medvedev accused Western countries, and especially the UK, of undermining the Nord Stream project and further increasing tensions between Russia and the West. Medvedev surprised even Russian leader Vladimir Putin by claiming that the UK was also responsible for the explosions in Nord Stream. Dmitry Medvedev made a crazy rhetoric by stating that the UK's submarine connecting cables and telecommunications vehicles should be targeted on the Nord Stream pipeline. As crazy as these statements sound, Putin's spokesman has officially declared that the UK should be openly targeted with these statements, which stunned even Vladimir Putin. It is clear that Medvedev forgot the rules of international politics. Although Russia itself was blamed for this explosion, Medvedev was actually trying to cause a crisis in the international political and diplomatic arena by using the mysterious situations in the pipeline. But there's one detail that the former Russian president forgot: if his rhetoric continues to be dangerous and provocative, just like the Russian Navy, the UK's naval forces, warships, submarines, and many more deterrent military elements are active in the Baltics, the North Sea, and many strategic naval areas. In other words, with these critical statements, Medvedev can stay under the submarine stallions of the UK. Already, the former Russian president has declared that British politicians have now become a legitimate military target for Moscow after UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly asserted that Ukraine has the right to use force within Russia's borders. Cleverly, in response, declared Ukraine's right to send forces beyond its borders as part of its self-defense following a series of drone strikes that hit Moscow's wealthiest neighborhoods. Now, the conflicts between the two seems to escalate after Medvedev's ludicrous statements that the UK connecting cables on the Nord Stream pipeline should be targeted because Medvedev seems to continue his threatening policies. Meanwhile, Medvedev's threat to target UK submarine cables adds a new layer of complexity to the ongoing tension between Russia and the Western world. This raises concerns about the potential escalation of war, and in an interconnected world, critical infrastructure is now much more at risk. Currently, the Nord Stream pipeline, a major energy project designed to transport natural gas from Russia to Western Europe, has long been the subject of geopolitical contention. Although Medvedev's threatening comments are considered utopian, Doubts about the safety of this pipeline have increased in recent days due to some dangerous actions by the Russians. NATO officials have expressed doubts that Europe's crucial underwater infrastructure is at stake, fearing that Russia could sabotage deep-sea pipelines to punish Western nations for Putin's support of Ukraine. In response to attacks on the Nord Stream pipeline in September 2022, which damaged 3 of the 4 main lines carrying gas from Russia to Germany, the NATO alliance is stepping up its efforts to protect submarine pipes and cables. An estimated $10 trillion worth of financial transactions pass through the cables of the underwater infrastructure every day, and this line is crucial to the economy. But these days, important marine areas where the Nord Stream is located are in danger. Concerns have risen these days that Russia may target submarine cables and other critical infrastructure in order to disrupt Western life, in order to gain an advantage over the nations that provide security to Ukraine. That's why the NATO bloc established the Critical Submarine Infrastructure Coordination Cell in February to monitor Russian espionage led by Lieutenant General Hans Werner, a retired German military officer, over concerns about the potential for power outages. Therefore, the Critical Submarine Infrastructure Coordination Cell is seen as a deterrent against the risky actions of the Russians. British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace has reported in recent days that Russian submarines are sailing on bizarre routes that deviate from what is considered typical by Western defense officials. Wallace noted the growing indications of Russian submarines operating off the coast of the United States and the Mediterranean, which appear to be Soviet-style submarine deployments reminiscent of the Cold War. Russian state media reported earlier this year that a new submarine division carrying nuclear-capable Poseidon super torpedoes for the Pacific Fleet will be installed as early as next year. According to the non-profit Nuclear Threat Initiative, in recent years, Russia has tried to upgrade its submarine fleet, as a result of which the Russian Navy has about 58 ships. Among them, some Russian submarines were reported to be circling the British coasts. For this reason, UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace states that the NATO alliance should be on the alert at all times against Russian submarines. So the West is still worried about a possible conflict with the Russian submarine fleet. As part of the ongoing exercise, NATO countries are being trained to monitor submarines to prevent possible attacks on underwater infrastructures such as cables and gas pipelines. In addition, NATO's military exercises are constantly continuing against the risky maneuvers of the Russian navies in the aforementioned sea areas. The 12-day military exercise, in which 12 NATO allies participated, focused on tracking down an alleged enemy submarine off the coast of Norway and Iceland. Despite NATO's military exercises, Russian submarines could potentially disrupt the security of commercial shipping or attempt to cut off military routes from which the United States supplies equipment and weapons to Europe. There is also the danger of Russian forces sabotaging submarine cables used to transmit data and electricity. For this reason, these critical measures taken by NATO and military exercises must increasingly continue, both in the Baltics and in strategic areas such as the North Sea, Irish Sea, UK coasts, and the Atlantic. David Kotler, NATO Deputy Secretary General for Intelligence and Security, reported that NATO ships patrol the Atlantic more frequently than in previous years, and that activities in the North and Baltic Seas are increasing. Mr. Kotler also warned that the enormous strategic benefit of being able to interfere with the West's energy, internet, and banking systems has drawn the attention of NATO's enemies, also due to the concern of such attacks. Poland is strengthening the military protection of its maritime energy infrastructure. The Polish government has passed a bill that gives the military the ability to sink an enemy ship if it poses a threat to an important gas pipeline from Norway to the Baltic Sea. The potential destruction of the vital undersea cables that Medvedev spoke of could have serious consequences for global telecommunications and internet connectivity. In addition, such a move could disrupt international communication networks, affecting businesses, governments, and individuals worldwide. But there was another interesting side to Medvedev's statements. The former Russian president blamed the West for the explosions in the Nord Stream pipelines. However, a few days before the explosions, interesting situations had occurred on the pipeline. The Danish Ministry of Defense reported that the Russian special ship SS-750, carrying a mini-submarine for deep-sea operations, was near the Nord Stream gas pipeline 4 days before the sabotage. The SS-750 is a ship designed for underwater operations and equipped with deep-sea equipment. It was photographed by a Danish patrol boat on September 22nd of last year. The photos were not made public as they were part of an ongoing reconnaissance mission. Jacob Kastberg, an expert of the European Analytical Center and a senior military intelligence, described the appearance of the SS-750 as interesting in the context of the investigation, since such a ship could carry out an operation. The investigation by the Danish Ministry of Defense also reported that Russia covered up the operation to blow up the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines with the maneuvers of its fleet, and that a small submarine could be used to transport explosives directly. In summary, almost all the countries of the world are struggling for a single purpose in order to suppress the negative policies of the Ukraine invasion, which Russia is trying to spread. Even if Russia tries to use risk policy strategies. In this regard, the New World Order is too important to be left to Medvedev or any Russian bureaucrat who cannot think clearly.